In August of last year, the United States hit India with a 50% tariff, one of the highest rates America has ever imposed on a major trading partner. 6 months later, that number was 18%. Same two countries, same two leaders, one massive reversal. In between, India's Prime Minister flew to China for the first time in 7 years, stood next to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping for the cameras, and Donald Trump reportedly told allies that America had lost India and Russia to China. This is the story of how the US and India went from allies, to a trade war, to a very awkward truce, and why the real story here was never really about trade at all. This is macro signal. Let's decode it. Here's the timeline, and it moves fast. In April, Trump's Liberation Day tariffs hit India with a 26% reciprocal rate. It got paused for 90 days. Then in July, it snapped into place at 25%. Then, in August, Trump added another 25% on top of that, specifically as a penalty for one thing: India's continued purchases of Russian oil. That's 50% total, applied almost overnight to one of America's largest trading partners. Then, the following February, the number dropped all the way down to 18%. Same administration, same two countries, 4 different tariff rates in under 12 months. That kind of swing isn't normal trade policy. That's leverage being applied hard, and then deliberately released. Let's ground this in the actual money, because the scale here is enormous. The US and India traded roughly $239 billion in goods and services combined in the most recent year on record. The US exported around $46 billion worth of goods to India. It imported almost $104 billion back. That gap of $58 billion trade deficit, up more than 27% from the year before, is the single number Trump kept returning to, at one point calling India the tariff king and describing the relationship as a totally one-sided disaster. And the 50% tariff wasn't abstract for India. It landed directly on textiles and clothing, worth over $10 billion in exports and employing 45 million people. It hit gems and jewelry, a $12 billion export category supporting 5 million jobs. Shrimp, leather, footwear, machinery all took direct hits. Exporters in some of these sectors reported turnover collapsing by up to half almost overnight. So why 50%, and why specifically in August follow the oil? India imports roughly 90% of the oil it uses, and since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russian crude has traded at a steep discount to global benchmarks, something like $16 a barrel cheaper than US or OPEC oil. For a country as energy hungry as India, that discount was very hard to walk away from, and India had in fact been increasing its Russian oil purchases through most of the year. But every discounted barrel was also revenue funding Russia's war in Ukraine. So the tariff penalty was never really about America's trade balance. It was economic pressure aimed squarely at Moscow, applied by squeezing New Delhi instead. And here's where it gets personal. Right in the middle of this tariff fight, in late August, Modi traveled to Tianjin, China, for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, his first visit to China in 7 years. The optics were brutal for Washington. Photos and videos showed Modi riding in a car with Xi Jinping, and standing alongside Vladimir Putin at a summit explicitly framed as a counterweight to Western influence. One American analyst summed up Trump's reaction bluntly: it looked like the US had pushed its own tariff target straight into the arms of China and Russia. Trump was reportedly furious, and the timing wasn't subtle. India's government was quite plainly showing Washington it had other options. That pressure campaign came to a head the following February, when Trump and Modi announced what both governments now call a historic trade deal. India agreed to lower tariffs on a range of American goods. The US, in turn, cut its rate on Indian exports textiles, leather, chemicals, machinery down to 18%. And critically, India committed to shifting its oil purchases away from Russia and toward the US and other suppliers. On paper, it reads like a trade agreement. In practice, it's closer to a ceasefire, both governments stepping back from a fight that was getting expensive for everyone, India's exporters most of all. It's worth pausing on how fast this all reversed. 6-month separate totally one-sided disaster from historic trade deal. That whiplash tells you the 50% tariff was never a fixed policy position, it was a pressure gauge, dialed up until India blinked on the one issue that actually mattered to Washington, and dialed back down the moment it did. Everything else, the deficit, the tariff king rhetoric, the sector-by-sector tariff schedules, was negotiating theater layered on top of a much simpler demand: stop funding Russia's war with discounted oil money. It's worth asking why India, out of every country hit with tariffs that year, got this level of attention and this rapid a reversal. Part of the answer is sheer scale. India is on track to become the world's third largest economy within a decade, with a population that recently overtook China's. But the bigger part is timing. Every U.S. administration since the early 2000s, Republican and Democrat alike, has tried to pull India closer as a hedge against China arms sales, nuclear cooperation, joint military exercises. What's different now is urgency. China isn't a slow-building, long-term concern anymore, it's actively weaponizing supply chains in real time, and that turns nice to have into need this partnership working, now. But the tariff headlines miss something much bigger happening underneath. In October, China suspended export controls on critical minerals and rare earths, the raw materials inside every semiconductor, electric vehicle, and defense system on the planet. That single move alarmed every government dependent on Chinese supply chains, the US very much included. The response was fast. The Quad, the US, India, Japan, and Australia rolled out a critical minerals initiative worth $20 billion, explicitly designed to route supply chains around China. India sits at the center of that plan. On semiconductors specifically, Modi and Trump had already launched something called the Trust Initiative back the previous February, naming chips as a core area for what they called trusted and resilient supply chains. Micron now runs a $2.75 billion chip facility in Gujarat. Intel is building a glass substrate plant in Odisha. This is the exact same China plus one logic we covered in our video on Vietnam's factory boom, except here it isn't just phones and sneakers, it's the entire chip and critical minerals supply chain. And that's precisely why Washington was willing to eat a messy, public trade fight rather than let India drift out of its orbit entirely. So who came out ahead? India's government would say it protected its energy security and its strategic independence for as long as it could, and still landed a lower tariff rate than the 50% peak. The US would say it got exactly what it wanted, a major Russian oil customer pulling back, and a firmer commitment from India to the semiconductor and critical minerals partnership. Indian exporters, meanwhile, are the group left holding the actual cost: months of collapsed orders in textiles, jewelry, and shrimp that don't simply reverse because a tariff rate changed on paper. That's usually how these disputes resolve: the two governments declare a mutual win, and the businesses caught in the middle absorb the damage that happened while the two sides were posturing. Signal check. The US-India tariff rate swung from 26% to 50% to 18% in under a year. Volatility driven by leverage over Russian oil purchases, not an actual trade dispute. Modi's trip to China, standing beside Xi and Putin, was India reminding Washington it has other partners. The $58 billion trade deficit is the political cover story, but the real prize is India's role in semiconductors and critical minerals, as the US races to build a supply chain that doesn't run through Beijing. Trade wars make the headlines. Supply chains make the decade. Macro Signal decodes the world economy. Country deep dives, rivalries, collapses, and the trends shaping global trade. Subscribe for new breakdowns every week. Next time, we go inside the other side of this relationship, the rallies, the handshakes, and whether any of that personal chemistry actually moves policy at all.